All right, so today we're going deep on Julian Assange.
Ooh, this will be good.
Yeah, you guys sent us a ton of research for this one. We've got reports on his early hacking, legal analysis of WikiLeaks' biggest releases.
Don't forget those first-hand accounts from people who knew him.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. What a story, right?
It really is. And one thing that really struck me going through all of this is just how polarizing Assange is.
Yeah.
Like, you'll see people calling him this champion of transparency, a digital Robin Hood, but then right alongside that, he's this reckless narcissist who put lives at risk.
Yeah, I see that too.
So, which is it, right? That's
Yeah.
what we're going to try to untangle today.
Yeah, and to even begin to do that,
Yeah.
I think we have to go back to the beginning.
Okay.
His childhood, his early days with hacking.
Absolutely. Those early years are crucial. So we know he had this really nomadic upbringing in Australia,
Right? Always on the move.
always on the move. And some people say that really fostered a sense of detachment in him, a distrust of traditional structures.
Yeah, I can see that.
And then as a teenager, he discovers computers and the internet.
Oh, yeah.
This whole new world just opens up for him.
And he doesn't just discover it. He masters it, right?
Right.
Like, this is a brilliant mind already pushing the boundaries of what was possible with tech. But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
He wasn't just some tech whiz playing games.
Right.
He was drawn to the cypherpunk movement.
Right.
This wasn't just about coding. It was about ideology.
Right. And the cypherpunks were almost like this digital counterculture. Privacy, cryptography, freedom from government control. These were their core beliefs.
Yeah.
They really believed that technology could be used to empower individuals and challenge the status quo. And even in those early days, Assange was all in on that.
Totally. And you see that reflected in his early hacking. That conviction he got breaking into the university network.
Right.
It wasn't about stealing data or anything. It was about proving a point, exposing vulnerabilities,
Challenging authority.
challenging authority, almost like a test run for what was to come with WikiLeaks.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about that incident as this turning point.
Mhm.
Was this a genuine act of principled hacking, or was there this element of ego, like maybe even a thrill-seeking element? Honestly, the sources aren't totally clear.
It's ambiguous.
It is, and I think that ambiguity kind of follows Assange throughout his life.
Interesting. Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. Now we're at the birth of WikiLeaks, a platform built on this, like, radical transparency.
Yeah.
What was his vision here? Was he really all about holding power accountable, or was something else driving him?
Well, on the surface, WikiLeaks really does seem like a natural evolution from those cypherpunk roots.
I see that.
It was about leveraging technology, encryption, anonymity to create this space where whistleblowers could safely expose wrongdoing.
No matter how powerful.
Exactly, no matter how powerful. But even with that being said, the sources do hint at a more complex picture.
You see this tension, right? On the one hand, these early leaks expose some serious injustice.
Oh, for sure. The Guantanamo Bay Manual, the Cry of Blood report on those Kenyan police killings.
Those were undeniably impactful,
Absolutely.
shining a light on things that definitely deserve scrutiny.
No question. But even then, there were questions, right?
Like what?
Well, Assange was indiscriminately dumping all of this information without redacting anything or properly vetting it. Was that truly the responsible thing to do? Could lives be put at risk? And was Assange's uncompromising stance, his refusal to, even engage with authorities, was that ultimately counterproductive?
Yeah, it's like he drew a line in the sand and refused to budge.
Yeah.
Even when he was presented with really valid concerns.
Which brings us, of course, to what's arguably WikiLeaks' most defining moment, the release of the collateral murder video.
2010, right?
Yep, 2010. Raw, uncensored footage of a U.S. airstrike in Iraq.
Sent shockwaves around the world.
It really did.
That video, it was deliberately provocative, even the title. And it changed everything. It forced the world to confront the reality of war, the human cost, and the callous disregard for civilian lives.
But it also ignited this huge debate about Assange's methods, his motives, and the potential consequences of totally unchecked transparency.
And that's where we see this shift in public perception.
Yeah.
Some people saw him as this hero, this truth teller going up against the military-industrial complex.
Right.
But others saw him as reckless, an ideologue, a danger to national security.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that all of this is happening while the Afghan and Iraq war logs are being leaked.
Huge document dumps.
Massive. revealing the true scale of civilian casualties, detailing these alleged war crimes and cover-ups.
The impact was undeniable.
Completely undeniable. But so was the backlash. Governments were scrambling to contain the fallout. And Assange was suddenly public enemy number one. They were calling him a traitor, an enemy of the state. And that's when things take a really dramatic turn. The Swedish allegations surface, adding a whole other layer of complexity.
Okay, let's unpack that because that's where things get murky. You have Assange and his supporters saying it was a setup.
Right, a politically motivated attempt to discredit him and get him extradited to the U.S.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, you have Swedish authorities insisting it was a legitimate investigation into some serious allegation.
Right, and the sources we have present conflicting accounts.
Yeah.
It's possible that both sides have some truth to them.
It really is. And it reminds us that even when we're dealing with someone like Assange, someone who seems so transparent on the surface, there are all these layers to uncover. And we're left asking, what's genuine? And what's carefully crafted to fit his narrative? That's a question that's going to come up again and again throughout this whole deep dive.
Absolutely. It's so easy to get caught up in the headlines.
Yeah.
But to really understand Assange, we have to look past all that.
We have to look at his patterns of behavior, the choices he made, his motivations, both what he said and what he implied.
So with those Swedish allegations out there, all this pressure mounting, Assange makes a dramatic move. He seeks asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy.
In London.
Yeah, in London.
A move that would define the next chapter of his life, turning him from this digital activist into a virtual prisoner, confined to a small apartment for years. Seeking asylum in the embassy? I mean, it was a bold move.
Desperate, even.
Yeah, some might even say that. But for Assange, it was a calculated risk. He really saw extradition to Sweden and then potentially to the U.S. as this existential threat.
To his whole mission.
Exactly.
It's hard to even imagine spending years confined to an embassy like that.
Yeah.
Knowing the whole world watching you, debating your every move. I have to wonder, did that isolation, that constant scrutiny, play a part in the more, I don't know, erratic behavior we see from him later on?
It's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was it genuine fear for his safety?
Right.
Or was there this element of self-aggrandizement? Assange has always been so good at controlling the narrative,
Well, yeah.
portraying himself as the victim, the persecuted truth teller.
Right.
But did that image eventually become a self-fulfilling prophecy?
You see it play out in how he ran WikiLeaks during those years. The Cablegate leak, with all those U.S. diplomatic cables,
Oh, yeah.
huge headlines, but it also alienated some of WikiLeaks' allies.
Right, the ones who felt he was getting too reckless, too focused on his own notoriety.
Yeah.
I mean, the sheer volume of those cables, hundreds of thousands of documents, it was overwhelming.
It was.
And some people argued that the really important revelations, the evidence of actual wrongdoing, got lost in all this mundane diplomatic chatter.
Yeah. And wasn't there criticism about the lack of redaction, putting informants and vulnerable people at risk?
There was.
Did Assange lose sight of the human cost in all this? You know, his quest for radical transparency?
That's a charge he always denied,
Right.
vehemently.
Right.
He insisted that WikiLeaks had a really rigorous vetting process, that they redacted things to protect sensitive information. But
Right.
the sources also show that there were internal disagreements within WikiLeaks.
Really?
Yeah. Concerns about Assange's leadership style, that it was becoming too autocratic.
So it's like this paradox. The guy who champions transparency and accountability is becoming increasingly opaque and unaccountable himself.
Exactly.
I mean, was that intentional, or did all the pressure, the constant threat of legal action, just warp his judgment?
Well, think about the psychological impact of all of this.
Though-
The constant surveillance inside the embassy, the never-ending legal battles, the smear campaigns.
Right.
He was under immense pressure, no doubt. Did that contribute to this siege mentality? Did he really believe he was justified in taking extreme measures to protect himself and his mission?
And then there's the Espionage Act. That's always looming.
Yeah, the U.S. government was clearly determined to make an example of him.
Absolutely.
Send a message to anyone else who might try to challenge their authority.
So what was their argument exactly? Were they really saying that any journalist who publishes classified information, even if it's in the public interest, is a criminal?
It was a little more nuanced than that. They claimed that Assange went beyond passive publishing, that he actively sought out classified information from Chelsea Manning, even offered to help her hack into government computers.
But those claims were disputed, right?
They were. Even the military judge in Manning's trial didn't find enough evidence to support that hacking charge.
Okay, so what about the impact of the leaks themselves? Did the U.S. government ever acknowledge that anything was wrong, that they learned any lessons from what WikiLeaks exposed?
Well, they certainly launched investigations, did some internal reviews, but rarely did they actually admit to any wrongdoing.
Right. Classic power dynamic.
Totally. The more truth that comes out, the more they dig in, double down.
But did that strategy backfire? Did trying to silence Assange just turn him into a more powerful symbol?
Well, it's undeniable that his case really galvanized this whole global movement.
Yeah, journalists, activists, human rights groups.
All rallying behind him, arguing that his prosecution threatened press freedom everywhere.
But some people felt he went too far, that his actions put lives at risk, undermine national security.
For sure. So is there some middle ground here?
Right. Can we acknowledge the harms caused by WikiLeaks while also defending government transparency as a principle?
That's exactly what we're wrestling with here.
Yeah.
We're trying to reconcile these competing values, recognizing that even when you're pursuing something noble, there can be unintended consequences.
It always comes back to Assange himself, doesn't it?
It does.
Did he understand the gravity of what he was doing? The potential for good and for harm?
Or was he just so convinced of his own righteousness, his role as this ultimate truth teller, that he couldn't see the nuances, the complexities?
It's like this kaleidoscope. Every turn shows you a new pattern.
It is.
But to understand the whole thing, you got to step back and look at all those parts together.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've seen Assange the hacker, the cypherpunk idealist, the activist.
Right.
But what about the man behind all that? What do these sources tell us about his character, his relationships, the choices that led him to this point?
Oh, that's where things get even more interesting.
Yeah.
We have glimpses into his childhood, his early relationships, accounts from people who worked with him.
Right.
And what emerges is this deeply complex, often contradictory person.
Someone who can inspire loyalty and devotion, but also prone to paranoia and control.
And a huge need for validation. We see moments of generosity, genuine concern for others,
Okay.
but also ruthlessness, willingness to exploit the people around him to achieve his goals.
It's a puzzle we may never fully solve.
And maybe that's the point.
Maybe trying to pin him down, hero or villain, that misses the whole point.
Exactly. The truth is rarely black and white. It's messy, it contradicts itself, and ultimately it's up to each of us to interpret.
I like that.
And with that, I think we need to move on to the final chapter of all of this, the extradition battle, the legal and political maneuvering, and the ultimate consequences of Assange's pursuit of transparency.
Okay, so here we are, final act. Assange is holed up in the embassy. This legal battle is raging all around him.
It really captivated the world.
Yeah.
But it also raises some pretty uncomfortable questions about how we're supposed to balance security and transparency in this digital age.
For sure.
And for Assange, this whole thing really became about survival.
Yeah.
Every move, every legal challenge, it was a fight against extradition.
Just to avoid facing those charges in the U.S.
Exactly.
His lawyers were throwing everything they could at it, right?
Yeah.
Arguing that the Espionage Act charges were politically motivated, that extraditing him would be a human rights violation, that his health was too fragile for a U.S. prison.
Oh, and they had some powerful voices backing them up on that.
What hope?
I mean, UN officials, human rights groups, even medical experts, they were all expressing serious concerns about Assange's well-being, both physically and mentally.
Yeah.
They argued that all of it, the isolation, the surveillance, the threat of a life sentence, it was just devastating.
I mean, it sounds like this Kafkaesque nightmare playing out in real life.
It really does.
A man trapped in diplomatic limbo, fighting this seemingly invincible force.
But even as this whole legal battle raged around him, Assange never stopped trying to control the narrative.
Right.
Giving interviews, publishing statements, using social media to rally his supporters.
Yeah.
He was determined to present himself as a martyr, a victim of this powerful state trying to silence him.
And for a while there, it looked like it might work. That UK judge, citing Assange's mental state and the risk of suicide, ruled against extradition.
What a victory that must have felt like.
Huge.
A real moment of hope for him and all of his supporters.
But it didn't last long.
No, it didn't. Just a few months later, the Ecuadorian government withdrew his asylum.
New leadership break.
Yep. They claimed he violated the terms of his stay.
So after 7 years, he's suddenly dragged out by the police.
Wild, right. Those images were everywhere.
Such a stark reminder of how quickly things can change.
They really were. And so with that, this whole long legal saga takes another turn. Remember that Swedish case, the one that kicked off this asylum thing in the first place? That got dropped. Not enough evidence.
No.
Yeah, but the U.S. was still waiting in the wings.
So even though he'd escaped extradition on the Espionage Act charges, he was still stuck.
back in a British prison.
this time facing a bail-jumping charge.
Right, relatively minor compared to everything else.
Yeah,
But it was enough to keep him locked up while the U.S. tried again for extradition.
and that's where we are now, isn't it? Assange is still fighting, his lawyers saying the Espionage Act charges are a threat to press freedom, that he was just doing his job as a journalist.
Publishing information in the public interest?
Exactly. But the U.S. government's holding firm to their position.
They're saying his actions were way beyond traditional journalism, that he conspired with Manning to steal information, put lives in danger.
It comes down to this question we keep bumping into.
Yeah.
Where's the line?
Where does transparency become a threat? When does a publisher become a criminal?
And these aren't easy questions to answer.
Not at all. They force us to think about some really complicated legal and ethical stuff, to weigh the potential harms and benefits of both secrecy and transparency.
And it's a debate that goes way beyond Assange himself, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's about the foundations of our democracy, our right to know what our governments are up to.
Right.
It makes us think about the role of technology in all of this. How do we protect whistleblowers who use platforms like WikiLeaks? How do we make sure journalists can do their job without being afraid of prosecution?
What about the impact of the leaks themselves? Did those revelations about war crimes and corruption actually lead to any real change?
Or did it just make people even more distrustful of institutions, make political divisions worse?
Tough questions.
Historians will be debating that for years to come. But one thing's for sure.
What's that?
Assange's actions, whether you think they were brave or reckless, they forced a global conversation.
About the limits of secrecy, the power of information.
And the responsibility that comes with it all. It's like he threw the stone into a pond, and those ripples are still spreading out, touching every part of the world.
That's a great analogy.
So where does that leave us? What's Assange's legacy? Will people remember him as this champion of transparency, this digital dissident who gave up his freedom for the truth?
Or will he just be seen as reckless, someone who ultimately caused more harm than good?
That's for everyone to decide on their own. We've explored his story, talked about his character, what drove him, but the final judgment, that's up to you.
I think the biggest takeaway here is that simple judgments, hero or villain, they don't really work when you're talking about human nature, do they?
No, they don't. Assange was complicated. He made brilliant choices, reckless choices, and those choices had huge consequences. His story makes us think critically, question what we think we know, and recognize that finding the truth is rarely simple.
Well said. And as we all try to navigate this increasingly complex digital world where information can be both a weapon and a shield, those lessons are more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Julian Assange.